Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be covering a game I played recently in the Scarborough Chess Championships. This was my round 1 game, and I was playing the black pieces, and let's take a look at what happened. So the game opened with e4, so I play c5, indicating the Sicilian defense. So here f4, this is one of the variations. Typically, white here, after the move f4, will probably go for knight c3 and go for a closed Sicilian typically, and try to generate something on the king side. So knight c6 here, and here the move c4. The move c4, I know when I played this during the game, actually, I knew c4 was not a good move. The main reason is because it blocks in this bishop here on f1. Because typically in some positions we want to put the bishop on c4, and also in other cases we want to play a move like d3 and expand like this, and not necessarily commit a pawn to c4 necessarily. So c4, d6, here knight to c3, here I play the move g6. So here against the closed Sicilian, I do have a certain setup I go for, which is kind of like a dragon setup combined with the move e6 and knight g to e7 with the point of going knight to d4 at some point. So knight f3 here, bishop g7, preventing the move d4. Here bishop to e2, here I just play e6, continuing to prevent d4, and since I'm putting my knight on e7, since I want to put my knight on e7, I should play the move e6 first. So here d3, knight g to e7, and this is sort of the setup I go for because it prevents the move f5, which is typically a very common break that white tries to go for in these types of positions in the closed Sicilian, to try to break open the king side and try to attack on the king side. Here bishop to e3, and here I castle. Another option I considered in the game was actually the move knight to d4, because I know typically in this type of a setup, whenever white plays the move bishop to e3, I want to play the move knight to d4. Point being that after takes, I kick this knight away, and then I can also play e5 next to consolidate my center. And alternatively, if knight takes d4, then after pawn takes, then this forks the knight and the bishop, which is kind of the point, because if I had played knight to d4 any earlier, then white can't play the move knight take. White could have played the move knight takes d4, because after c takes, the bishop wouldn't have been here. So castles, however, castles, in here b6. The point of b6 is basically I want to play the move d5 here at some point to try to break open the center. But the issue is that if I play d5 right now, then there's bishop captures on c5 and white would win a pawn. So instead I play the move b6 first to defend this pawn, and also to allow my bishop to get to this diagonal on b7, because currently this diagonal here towards g4 is currently blocked. So I'm going to put my bishop on b7 instead. Rook b1 here, which isn't a good move, and here I play d5, because the point of rook b1, there is no really big point with the move rook b1. Like, you can't play the move b4 because there's knight takes, not to mention there's bishop takes c3. You can't play b3 because of the same reason, so there's really no point behind rook b1. So here immediately I strike forward with the move d5, and here takes, and here my opponent actually plays bishop f2, which for some reason I actually missed. Because originally I thought my opponent had to take because I was threatening a fork on d4, but after takes, and queen takes, I knew this position had to be winning for black because of this really bad pawn structure that white has. This d3 pawn is really unstable and can get targeted really quickly with my rooks, as well as my queen and my knight and my bishop. Not to mention right now the a2 pawn is hanging, and also this bishop on g7 is eyeing this pawn on b2. However, instead here my opponent found the move bishop f2, which is a great move. Point being that they don't have to take immediately, and now the threat is to play d5 and then play something like knight b5, knight to d6. And here if I play forwards with the move d4, for example, then here after knight b4 my opponent can reroute their knight to a3 and potentially put the knight on c4. So instead here I decide to take on e4, opening up the center a little bit, and go for some practical counterplay. I know this move isn't necessarily the best, however, I knew this probably generates the most chances. So here, basically after d takes e4, white has to play d captures on e4. Knight captures on e4 leads to a similar position as earlier in the variation where we exchanged everything and my queen was on d5. Point being that this pawn structure here is still really bad, and after a move like bishop e6 to target the a2 pawn, black is considerably better here. So after takes, bishop f2 takes, so d takes e4 is pretty much forced, and here I play bishop captures on c3. And then after pawn captures on c3, here I play queen captures on d1, rook takes, and here bishop to e6, getting my final piece into the game and also targeting the a2 pawn. And so this is kind of the reason why I went for this, is because white's queenside structure is really now battered because of the c3 and a2 pawn weaknesses, and those are pawns I can potentially target in the future. So here after rook d2, I play rook a to d8, and here my opponent doubles up with rook b to d1. Point is that now there may be some rook captures on d8 ideas in the future, but here I find rook captures on d2, rook captures on d2, and here I play rook d8. Because I realize that if white gets this rook on this open file, then it won't be good for black because, well, white would have basically control of all the squares here on the d file and can at some point probably even access d7, which could be devastating for black. So here I play the move rook d8 to sort of force off the rooks, and if white moves their rook to somewhere else, then black just simply gains control, and black would be better in that case. So rook takes d8, knight takes d8, and here bishop h4, attacking both the knights. Here I play knight d to c6 to defend this knight on e7, and my point is to go knight c8 and probably play knight to d6 and try to get my knight into a more active post. So here a3, getting the pawn out of the way of the bishop. So here I play knight to c8. Point is I want to go knight to d6 to attack this e4 pawn, and if white pushes forward with e5, then I have knight to f5. So here knight to g5, bishop to b3, defending f7 and also moving my bishop away from knight takes e6. Here e5 is played to prevent knight d6, and here I play my knight back to e7. The point is now this f5 square is now open because the pawn, which was originally on e4, controlled that square. However, by pushing forwards, it no longer does. And also, not only am I threatening knight f5, I'm also threatening the move knight to d4, which would actually fork the c3 pawn and the f4 pawn. So here my opponent plays g4, which is actually a mistake because this allows the move knight d5, attacking both these pawns, meaning I'm going to win one of them. Bishop f3 is the only logical defense. Point is that if I, let's say, take either c3 or take on f4, then there's bishop captures on c6, winning a free piece. So instead here I play knight a4, getting the piece out of the way, still threatening both of these pawns. So bishop captures on e4, e5 is basically forced, bishop captures on d5, and this is basically my point. These two pawns, the c3 and the a3 pawn, which I had intentionally gone for by going into this endgame, are now going to get targeted with moves like knight c4 and bishop c6 if the pawn ever steps forward. So here bishop f2, so here immediately I put my knight on c4, and what you'll notice is that this c4 square is actually a light square, which I purposely aimed for because with the bishop trade earlier, here after bishop captures on d5, white no longer has a really strong presence on the light squares anymore. So immediately I shift my strategy to start putting my pieces on light squares so they can't be targeted easily. And I'm also attacking the a3 pawn. So here a4 was played, and here firstly I start off with the move h6. Here I could also immediately play the move bishop c6, however I thought after the move f5 there's some general chances for white to do something here. After, let's say, pawn takes and bishop captures on a4, I thought maybe there's a move e6 in some cases, or even a move like f6 to really restrict my king, and then somehow if white can bring their king in and start targeting my pawns, then it could get a little bit dangerous. So I just went for the more practical approach, which is to basically kick my opponent's pieces back. So here immediately I start off with the move h6. Instead of bishop c6, here I start off with the move h6 first, knight back to h3, and here I play the move bishop to f3. Point is I'm attacking this g4 pawn, and there's no way for white to actually defend it besides from moving it forward. And if white ever plays the move g5, my point is to play h5, and you'll see this knight here is really stuck on the edge of the board. The only access square that my opponent has for this knight is to either go back to g1 or to f2, both of which are currently occupied by another white piece. And in the meantime, while white tries to untangle, I'm able to play bishop c6, bishop takes a4, and play a5, a4, a3. And you'll notice that those moves are very natural, whereas white has to sort of contort their position a bit to be able to untangle. However, instead here, my opponent plays the move bishop to h4, trying to get some more active counterplay. I play bishop takes g4, knight f2, and bishop d7, targeting this pawn. My opponent can't play the move a5 because it can be taken two different ways with the b pawn or the knight. So here my opponent plays knight e4, trying to go after knight f6 check, winning a bishop. Here I just very simply play bishop captures on a4. Here and the move bishop e7. Point is that my opponent's trying to go for some type of a perpetual by locking my king into this sort of box here with the move knight f6 check and trying to coordinate this bishop and this knight somehow to get some perpetual check. However, here I calculate that there is nothing and I just simply play bishop c6, attacking the knight. Knight into f6 check, king g7 very simply, and here king to f2. My opponent realizes, I think at this point, that there's no way to actually deliver a perpetual check because simply my pieces control too many squares, and it's not basically feasible for that to happen. Let's say knight g4 to prepare bishop f6. Here I can just start pushing my pawn, bishop f6, and here I can simply play a move like king to f8, and here there's actually no checks for white, and my king is going to be able to escape to the queen side. I can even sacrifice a pawn here, but you'll realize that these two pieces, they're not in an optimal position to be able to actually attack my king. So instead here, my opponent, after knight f6 check, king g7, plays king f2. I just start pushing my pawn a5, king to e2, and a4. And here I realized that in this case, I'm guaranteed to win pretty much. I know this is already completely winning, but I was trying to find the cleanest way to win. And here I realized that there's actually no way that white can actually prevent my threats, because I was worried about king d3 initially. However, I realized here I simply have the move a3. And if my opponent plays king captures on c4 after a2, there's no way that white can actually stop my pawn from being able to promote, at which point I would be up a queen and winning the game. Which is why this was sort of the main threat I was worried about. However, after I noticed that I have the move a3, I wasn't concerned at all. So here knight g4 was played. I play the move a3, bishop f6 check, and here I simply play king f8, demonstrating sort of the position I showed earlier, where if my opponent plays knight takes h6, then after a2, there is no perpetual check that can be delivered by these two pieces. There's actually no check in this position that actually makes sense to be delivered anyway. Bishop g7, bishop e7 are the only threats, or checks, and I can just simply capture the bishop in both those cases. So instead, however, my opponent plays the move knight back to e3, trying to play knight c2 if I play a2 immediately. However, here I just simply play knight takes e3, calculating correctly that even though we have opposite colored bishops, this endgame is completely winning, because after a move like king takes, after a2, there are two pawns in the way of white's bishop, so white's bishop on f6 can't actually control the a1 promotion square, meaning that I'll be able to get a new queen. So instead here, my opponent plays e6, trying to generate some counterplay. Point is that, like, let's say after a move like a2, then maybe there's some e7 check, and then like some move like c4, and trying to prevent basically the promotion of the queen, this is actually what happened in the game. However, after the move c4 here, I very simply play knight to c2, getting my knight out of the way of my opponent's king, and here also supporting the promotion square on a1, meaning that my opponent will have to sacrifice their bishop for the pawn, at which point I would have an extra pawn, two extra pieces, as well as a completely winning position, because I'll be able to clean up all of white's pawns and make a bunch of queens and checkmate. So it was actually in this position, after knight c2, my opponent ended up resigning the game, seeing as the reasons I mentioned before, too many threats, up too many pieces, and checkmate is pretty much imminent. So I would say, relatively speaking, a very smooth game. In the opening, sort of realizing early on that the move c4 was bad and trying to punish it as soon as possible here by going for my setup here and trying to break open the center, realizing that white's position, although it looks great with a lot of space in the center, isn't actually that good because of sort of certain threats here, such as rook b1 not being a great move, and basically black having the positional advantage here after a move like let's say takes and queen takes, and realizing that this position has a lot of positional benefits for black, meaning that I'm very confident to go for this. And even though there are certain moves which I missed, such as bishop f2, I wasn't afraid of them, and I still went for sort of a more practical approach, converting into an endgame which had weaknesses for white, and not really having any weaknesses for black, really, as black's position is really solid, even though it's a bit passive, and slowly converting that into a winning position. So yeah, so hope you all enjoyed that game, and thanks for watching.